I used to think every story about tenants refusing to pay rent was the same, a tale of freeloaders, excuses, and endless frustration. But that was before I discovered the truth about apartment 3B, before I understood what 30 years of unpaid rent could really mean. When my father passed away, I inherited the old brownstone on Maple Avenue, a sturdy, aging relic from another time. He'd managed the building himself, even in his 80s, and for the most part, it ran smoothly. Except for one unit, 3B. My father had mentioned the quiet man upstairs once or twice, but never with irritation, just restraint. He's been there a long time, Dad would say, his eyes softening in a way I didn't quite understand. When I took over, I did what any responsible landlord would do. I looked through the accounts. Everything was in order except for a glaring entry. Tenant hashtag 3B, no payments since 1995. At first, I thought it had to be a clerical error. But when I asked the accountant, she simply shrugged. Your father said to leave it be. Leave it be? For 3 decades? The more I looked into it, the stranger it seemed. There was no lease on file, no bank transfers, just a single handwritten note in my father's ledger beside the man's name. Paid in other ways. That phrase stayed with me. It felt heavy, almost sacred. So, one rainy afternoon, I climbed the creaking staircase to apartment 3B to finally meet this mystery tenant. I remember pausing outside the door, hearing the faintest sound of a piano, an old waltz, played tenderly but hesitantly, as if from another world. I knocked, and when the door opened, I came face to face with a man who looked both familiar and foreign, like a shadow from my father's past. Something told me that this visit would not end with a rent check, but with a story that would change how I saw my father, my home, and the meaning of debt itself. Sometimes, what we owe has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with love. The man who opened the door was thin, perhaps in his late 70s, with a soft gray beard and eyes that seemed both alert and tired, like someone who had watched too many seasons pass through the same window. He wore a worn cardigan and held a porcelain mug that trembled slightly in his hands. "Mr. Lewis?" I asked, trying to sound polite but firm. He nodded once. "You must be Thomas's son." There was no trace of surprise in his voice, only quiet recognition, as if he'd been expecting me. "Yes," I said. "I'm David." He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The apartment was unlike anything else in the building. Where other units had been updated with modern appliances and fresh paint, 3B seemed frozen in time. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture heavy and old-fashioned. And on the table, beside a dusty metronome, sat a framed photo of my father. Younger, smiling, arms slung around this very man. I stopped cold. "You knew my father well?" I asked. Mr. Lewis set his mug down gently. "We were close once, before life took us down different roads." There was a long pause filled only by the hum of the radiator. I took a breath and pulled out the folder I'd brought. "I'm reviewing the records for the property. It looks like you haven't paid rent since, well, since before I graduated high school." He didn't flinch. "Yes, your father and I had an understanding." "An understanding?" He looked toward the piano, its lid open, yellowed sheet music spread across it. "If you sit, I'll tell you. But I'd rather you hear the music first." Something in his tone made me comply. I sat as he began to play, slow, deliberate, haunting. It wasn't until the final note faded that I realized I was holding my breath. Sometimes silence is the only place where truth dares to speak. When the last note lingered and disappeared into the room's stillness, Mr. Lewis looked at me, not defiant, not apologetic, but with the kind of calm that comes from carrying a truth too long to fear its telling. "That was your father's song," he said quietly. "He called it the Debt Waltz. We wrote it together in this very room, before you were born." I frowned. My father wasn't a musician. He smiled faintly. "No, he was a dreamer, though. He used to come up here after work, before he married your mother. I taught piano back then, mostly children from the neighborhood. Your father would bring his lunch, a sandwich, sometimes two, and sit right there, trying to learn. He never got far, but he tried." I was still trying to connect the dots. "What does that have to do with rent?" "Everything," he said. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed, fragile, the edges curling like old leaves. He handed it to me. It was a handwritten agreement, dated 1995, signed by both him and my father. The terms were baffling. Tenant 3B, no monetary rent due, so long as the tenant maintains the instrument, the space, and the music that fills it. Payment is made through preservation and presence. I blinked, reading it twice. This isn't legal. It's sentimental. Maybe, but your father was very clear about his rules. The music had to be played here every week. The piano had to stay in tune, and the apartment had to remain open to anyone who needed a place to listen. I glanced toward the piano again. You mean strangers come here? He nodded. Sometimes they still do. Grieving people. Lost ones. Your father used to send them up. I didn't know whether to laugh or to feel moved. What kind of man forgave 30 years of rent for music and grief? And what kind of son could measure that in dollars? Sometimes, what looks like madness is mercy written in a different language. Over the next few days, I couldn't get apartment 3B out of my head. I'd grown up believing my father was a practical man, disciplined, cautious, allergic to sentiment. Yet here was proof of a secret arrangement, hidden above our heads for decades, built not on contracts, but on trust. I found myself walking upstairs more often, pretending I needed to check the radiator or the wiring. But really, I just wanted to understand. Mr. Lewis didn't mind my curiosity. In fact, he seemed quietly amused by it. Each time, he'd make tea, turn on the lamp with the cracked green shade, and talk. He told me stories of how my father used to come upstairs after long workdays, how the music helped him unwind, how, in the years after my mother died, he'd send people up, widows, veterans, neighbors, to sit in silence while Mr. Lewis played. They'd leave lighter, he said simply, like the music lifted something off them. I wanted to believe it, but the rational part of me kept asking questions. Why didn't he tell me? Why keep this secret? Maybe he thought you'd understand one day, Mr. Lewis said. Maybe he wanted to leave you something you couldn't buy or sell. That night, I went through my father's old office downstairs. I searched through drawers, boxes, even the attic, until I found another clue, a small brass key tied with a faded red ribbon. On the tag was a single word, 3B. I brought it upstairs the next morning. Mr. Lewis smiled when he saw it. You found it, he said softly. What does it open? I asked. He pointed to a wooden chest under the piano bench. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes, all addressed to different people, written in my father's handwriting. Each one began with the same phrase. If you're reading this, it means you heard the music. I realized then, 3B wasn't just a tenant's home. It was a sanctuary, and my father had built it quietly, one act of compassion at a time. Sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't properties at all, they're promises still being kept. I sat there, staring at the envelopes spread across the coffee table. Each one was carefully dated and sealed, some yellowed with age, others newer, as if my father had been writing them right up until the end. Did you ever open one? I asked. Mr. Lewis shook his head. Never. He left that to whoever they were meant for. People came, they listened, sometimes cried, and left with one of those letters. I never knew what they said. I picked one at random. It was addressed simply, to the woman in the blue scarf. I hesitated, then looked at Mr. Lewis for permission. He gave a small nod. Inside was a single sheet of paper, my father's handwriting as familiar as the sound of his voice. You once told me you'd forgotten what kindness sounded like. If you're here, let the music remind you. You are not forgotten. Signed, a friend who remembers. My chest tightened. My father had been many things, a landlord, a widower, a man who rarely spoke of feelings. But this was something I'd never seen. Mr. Lewis smiled faintly. He started that after your mother passed. Said he couldn't bear the silence. Music, letters, visitors, it gave him a reason to keep living. I felt the sting of tears. So he never took rent because you kept it going. Yes, that was the deal. I played. People came. He wrote. Together we kept the light on. I ran my hand over the piano's smooth wood, realizing how much of my father's heart had lived in that instrument, in this quiet upstairs room. All those years, I thought he'd grown distant after my mother's death, but now I saw it differently. He hadn't withdrawn from the world. He'd found a secret way to heal it, and maybe, without realizing it, he'd left that responsibility to me. Sometimes revelation doesn't arrive like thunder. It whispers through an open door, asking whether you're ready to listen. The next week brought a storm. Not the kind that shakes windows, but the kind that brews inside a family when old truths surface. When I told my sister, Anna, About what I'd found in apartment 3B, she was furious. You're joking, right? Dad let some stranger live rent-free for 30 years? While we scraped to pay for college. Her voice cut through me. Anna, it wasn't about rent. It's always about rent, David. Or at least about fairness. You're being naive. Her words echoed through me long after she hung up. Maybe she was right. Maybe sentiment couldn't justify what my father had done. Maybe, by letting this continue, I was being irresponsible too. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ledger, the letters, the strange piece of 3B, it all tangled in my thoughts. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to know who these letters had reached. Mr. Lewis helped me piece it together. Some envelopes had names. Others, only descriptions. The boy with the violin, the widow from Elm Street. We began searching old records, even knocking on doors. And slowly, one by one, people began to remember. There was a retired nurse who said she came up every Wednesday after her shift, just to listen. That music kept me from breaking, she whispered. A man in his 60s who'd lost his son to cancer said my father's letters gave him a reason to keep breathing. Each story deepened the mystery, but also the meaning. My father hadn't just forgiven rent. He'd built a quiet ministry of healing through music and presence. But as I listened, a darker question grew inside me. What happens when Mr. Lewis is gone? When the piano falls silent? That evening, as if hearing my thoughts, Mr. Lewis said softly, "Your father told me one day you'd have to decide whether to keep it alive or to lock the door." It wasn't just a building I'd inherited. It was a choice between compassion and convenience, between legacy and ledger. Kindness, it seemed, always comes with a test of courage. 2 days later, Anna showed up at the brownstone without warning. The autumn air followed her in, sharp and cold, as she stepped into the hallway clutching a folder of papers. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she said. "We can evict him legally. The agreement isn't binding. It's handwritten nonsense. You'll just have to serve notice." Mr. Lewis was in the kitchen making tea when she said it. He didn't interrupt, just listened quietly, stirring sugar into his cup. "Anna, please," I began. "Just come upstairs. Listen first." "Listen to what?" "A piano?" she snapped. "We need to be adults, David. This isn't a charity." But she followed me anyway, up the narrow stairs, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. Mr. Lewis sat at the piano waiting. Without a word, he began to play the Debt Waltz. It started softly, fragile, almost trembling, then grew stronger, warmer. Halfway through, the melody changed, weaving in something new, something unfamiliar. Anna's anger faltered. She glanced at me, eyes uncertain. When the final note hung in the air, she whispered, "What was that?" Mr. Lewis smiled faintly. "Your father's last edition. He said it was unfinished until his children heard it." Anna covered her mouth, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. I reached for the folder in her hands and set it down. "He built this place to heal people, Anna. Maybe we don't have to understand it to honor it." Her eyes shimmered. "And what happens when he's gone?" she asked quietly, glancing at Mr. Lewis. He met her gaze, gentle and steady. "Then it's your turn to decide what music means to you." I felt it then, the full weight of inheritance, heavier than any mortgage, lighter than any burden of guilt. Every generation faces a moment when the heart must choose what the law cannot. And that moment had come for us. A week later, Mr. Lewis fell ill. It was sudden, a cold that deepened too fast, leaving him weak and pale. I visited every day, bringing soup, fresh flowers, anything to fill the silence that had once been his music. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, he called me to his bedside. "There's something your father left for you," he said, his voice thin but steady. "In the piano." I frowned. "In the piano?" He smiled faintly. "You'll see." When he drifted back to sleep, I lifted the piano's lid and found a small velvet pouch taped beneath the frame. Inside was a gold key, heavier than it looked, and a folded note in my father's handwriting. "For when the music stops." The key opens the bottom drawer of my desk. "You'll know what to do." Downstairs, I unlocked the drawer. Inside lay a new deed, not to the building, but to something called the Maple Sanctuary Trust. The beneficiary line read, "To be managed by my children, in memory of those who found peace in apartment 3B. There was also a final letter addressed to us both. I built walls to hold tenants, but I learned it was people's hearts that needed shelter. If you choose to keep the door open, you'll find the rent comes in ways that can't be counted. When I read it aloud to Anna, tears filled her eyes. She nodded slowly. "We'll keep it," she said. "But not as landlords, as caretakers." Mr. Lewis passed away 2 days later, quietly, with his hands resting on the keys. We buried him beside my father, beneath a maple tree whose leaves fell like old sheet music. That spring, we reopened apartment 3B as the Maple Sanctuary, a place where anyone could come listen, play, or simply breathe. And every Sunday, I sit at the same piano, trying to play the debt waltz. I still miss half the notes, but maybe that's the point. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid, only continued. It's been 2 years since we reopened the Maple Sanctuary. The old brownstone still creaks in winter, and the pipes still hum in the mornings, but it feels alive again. The door to apartment 3B is never locked. Some days, a retired teacher practices scales there. Other days, a young mother comes just to sit and cry. No one pays rent. But somehow, the bills always get covered. Donations left in envelopes, a check that arrives from nowhere, a neighbor who fixes the stairs for free. It's as if kindness, once started, found a way to sustain itself. Every time I sit at the piano, I think about my father and Mr. Lewis. 2 men who made a promise most would call foolish. Yet it was that very foolishness that turned a simple apartment into a refuge. I've come to believe there's a strange kind of wisdom and generosity that doesn't ask to be understood. Anna visits often now. She brings cookies and tea, listens to the visitors' stories, and sometimes joins me on the bench. The first time she did, she said quietly, "I used to think Dad left us with debt. Now I see he left us with purpose." One afternoon, a little boy wandered in with his grandmother. He sat at the piano and tapped the keys like he was testing the air. Then he looked up and asked, "Do you know the debt waltz?" I smiled. "I'm still learning it." He nodded seriously. "Then I'll learn it too." The room filled with light then, not sunlight exactly, but something warmer, something like grace. As I watched him play, I realized the music would outlive all of us. Because legacies aren't built from what we keep, they're built from what we give away. So, if you ever find yourself passing Maple Avenue, and you hear a piano through an open window, come inside. Sit. Listen. Maybe the song will remind you of someone you've loved, or someone you've forgiven. And if you leave lighter than you arrived, well, that's the rent paid in full.